Hello, and welcome to the sixth talk of our Wonder Kids series. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Portia Queevy, and I'm the recruitment coordinator for the Early Development Research Group here at UBC. Speaking to us is Dr. Andrew Barron, who along with his wonderful team of trainees at the Social Cognitive Development Lab and the Living Lab at ScienceWorld, studies how children establish preferences for and beliefs about people, and the strategies that can help foster a greater tolerance in their reasoning about social groups. Dr. Barron's Social Cognitive Development Lab is one of 7 research centers that make up the Early Development Research Group. Because much of the research that Dr. Barron will tell us about today took place on campus at the University of British Columbia, I would like to acknowledge that our campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territory of the Musqueam people. But of course, this event is virtual, and so I would like to acknowledge as well the traditional owners and caretakers of the many lands that you may be joining from, both near and far. I will introduce Dr. Barron in just a moment, and he will speak for about 30 minutes. Afterwards, he will answer your questions, taking us to about 2 o'clock. Please do feel free to pop in and out as you need. We understand that most of you have little ones at home. To gather your questions, we will use the Q&A window that you may access via the button along the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please submit your questions there and/or upvote questions from others that you would like to have answered. If you're unable to stay for the entire talk or have technical issues, don't worry. We will be posting a recording of the talk on the EDRG website. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Barron Andrew to you today. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at UBC. Dr. Barron gained his PhD in psychology in 2010 from Harvard University in the United States, and in that same year began teaching at UBC. His research on how children reason about social life, exploring a range of topics from their understanding of social status to attitudes and stereotypes about gender and race, has been a recipient of several grants and awards. Dr. Barron's accomplishments have been recognized with the UBC Killam Research Prize and the Association for Psychological Science Rising Star Award. Dr. Barron is also a student favorite here at the UBC, and this is evident in his receipt of the Robert E. Knox Master Teaching Award. I'm sure his talk today will give you a glimpse of why his courses are favorites among UBC psychology students. So not to keep you waiting any longer, please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Barron.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to share with you all about some of the research that's come out of my lab. So one of the things that I want to just mention, and Portia, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to focus on research of mine that has looked at this question of what do babies understand about social dominance. But as Portia described, my lab actually does a lot of exciting research across childhood and adolescence. So not just in infancy, looking at the origins and development of race bias, gender bias. We do a lot right now around gender and stereotypes about math and science and ways to foster greater inclusion among girls in particular in math and science, and what strategies are that we can focus on. And so we do a range of research, but the focus for today anyway will be on social dominance. But if any of those topics interest you at all and you want to chat with me or ask questions about those topics in the Q&A, you're welcome to, or just send me a message outside of this. I'd be happy to engage in conversations about those topics as well at a later point in time. So I'm excited today to talk with you about this question about what do babies understand about social dominance. But before I talk with you about those findings, I think it's really important just to acknowledge that this is a team effort, and really this research has been spearheaded in my lab by graduate student Anthea Pun and an undergraduate student, Jerwin Legaspi. And they've really been the driving force as well as the faces behind this research. If you came to our lab, you would have likely have interacted with one of these two individuals. And so before I begin delving into this, I want to just pause for a moment and think a bit about what comes to mind when you think about social dominance and what this might mean to you. And I think that for many of us, when we hear this phrase of social dominance, we try to think of someone who must be in charge, right? Maybe it's a person who's everyone is showing deference to, listening to, a leader. The person who maybe sets the rules and sort of gets to say how things go. As a parent myself, I like to think that I actually fulfill this role, that I'm the one in charge, and I'll say what goes and what doesn't go, and my child will listen. But when my son turned 4, I do think somehow the tables turned a little bit, and it seemed that he thought he was in charge and he could tell me how things are supposed to be, and it was my job to listen. And the spirit of this, right, is that when we think of this notion of social dominance, this idea that one person can have greater influence over another person's behavior. And when you step back and just look at this in the wild, in the animal kingdom, we see all kinds of examples of social dominance, often in situations involving conflict between two animals. And a recurring theme really emerges when you look at how animals interact, social animals in particular. And that is often that the bigger animal prevails, and social dominance is often established vis-a-vis strength, right? And a bigger size often confers that advantage over someone of a smaller size. But one thing we know from studying animals and observing animal behavior is that there's also strength in numbers. And what I mean by that is that even though you might be up against someone who head to head is bigger than you, if you've got more allies around, you might be able to overpower them, right? And you can see how the lion's in the top left corner overpowering this one individual, but when many more of those individuals are present, like in the top right corner, right, the lions are trying to escape. And we know that in the context of how animals behave, that you can outnumber your opponents. And even if your opponent is bigger than you, more allies seems to trump, meaning is affords you more of a competitive advantage than just size alone. And the question is, given these kinds of principles, that bigger is better, that there's a benefit to having more allies when you're engaged in a conflict, the first question our research team set out to try to ask is whether babies can think about any of these aspects of social dominance. And so the first research really tried to investigate whether babies have intuitions about any of these principles. Can they reason, for example, that size is relevant when two individuals are competing with each other? And so I want to tell you about the first study. This isn't a study that came from my lab, but it's one that really inspired our lab to investigate in much more depth the complex ways in which infants could think about social dominance relationships. And in this particular study, this was with 12-month-old babies, they wanted to establish a situation where there was conflict between two individuals. And with babies, of course, there's not so many displays of conflict that are really appropriate to show them. But we thought about a situation, or the researchers thought about a situation where there was a conflict of goals, where they saw that on their own, the blue agent wanted to cross the platform in one direction, and on their own, the green agent wanted to cross the platform in the opposing direction. And then they would see a video that looked like this, where both agents would try to cross at the same time, but they couldn't achieve this because they would bump into each other. And then they saw a situation where one agent deferred to the other agent, stepped back, so that agent could keep going on their way. And what the researchers did is they would show an event like this where the larger agent got their way, the bigger agent got their way. And the prediction was that if infants think that the bigger agent is more dominant, then they should expect that agent to prevail, meaning that this should be an expected outcome for them to witness. And so some of the babies would see an event like this, where the larger agent was able to cross the platform and the smaller agent got out of their way. But others saw the opposite of this. Other babies would look at situations where the smaller agent actually prevailed. And in this case, the bigger agent showed that deference. But again, this should be somewhat surprising. So how on earth do you measure what a baby at 12 months of age thinks? If you've attended some of our other talks in this series, you might remember some methods that have started to get at how do you study what infants think. For those of you who are new, I'll just give you a quick recap. The basic premise is that, much like adults, when we see something that is expected, we kind of get bored by it. But when we see something that's unexpected or surprising to us, we stare at it, trying to figure out what happened. You could imagine, for example, a great story I like to tell is if you are at a magic show, or you could imagine yourself at a magic show and you see a person who appears to have been sawed in half. And then the boxes are separated and you can see the parts moving and the person smiling and talking. And our mind is trying to figure out how on earth did this happen? And we're sitting there, mouth is open, eyes wide, trying to make sense of this. Babies in infancy do the same thing. They stare at things and show surprise when something's unexpected, and they get bored by things much quicker if it's expected. And so for us, given the predictions, we determined that if the bigger agent gets their way, we call this the expected outcome. And if babies are watching a video like this, in contrast to the unexpected outcome where the smaller agent prevails, we expected that babies would be really bored watching these the big agent win if this were something that they thought should have happened, and they should be really surprised and shocked and spend much more time looking at this unexpected outcome. And so we just measure the total amount of time that babies spend looking at these different kinds of displays. And what we found is that babies looked much longer at this unexpected outcome when the smaller agent prevailed. And what that tells us is that babies have an intuition that bigger is stronger and that the bigger agent should get their way. And that's why they're so surprised when the opposite of that actually transpires. But we also know, as I mentioned earlier, that there's strength in numbers. And so what our lab wanted to try to address was this second question of whether babies think about social group dominance. So now we just showed you that they expect bigger is stronger, but do babies have intuitions that a group with more allies is likely to be dominant over a group with fewer allies? And so here's how we approach this work in my lab. We first established that there's two groups of agents, the green group and the blue group. And there's clearly more green agents than blue agents. And they'd first see that they have a conflict. Okay, so first they see group of three, group of two, one agent from each group comes down. They try to cross that platform and they can't both do it at the same time. And then infants, and these are 6 to 12-month-olds, would see two different kinds of test events. One where the bigger agent, or the agent from the larger group prevails. And we added some nice sound effects just to make it entertaining and more so for the babies. So this would be the expected outcome where the agent from the numerically larger group gets their way. And they would also see a test trial that looked a little bit different where the blue person would get to cross. Excellent. Now, of course, I call this the expected and unexpected outcomes. The real question, of course, is whether babies have any expectations about which of these is a more likely scenario to observe. And so again, babies would see both of these events, the expected outcome and the unexpected outcome. And our prediction was this: if babies of this age, 6 to 12 months of age, think that the numerically larger group is more dominant, then they should expect that, that agent from the numerically larger group to prevail when there's this conflict about who gets their way trying to cross the platform. And so again, when we're measuring this, the expectation is that babies should be more bored or bored faster by watching the expected outcome video, meaning they should look a lot less at this, compared with the unexpected outcome video, where we would expect them to show much more surprise when an agent from the numerically smaller group wins, in which case we'd expect babies to stare a lot longer at this type of event. And this is in fact what we found, that babies stared much longer at this unexpected outcome. And what this suggests to us is that already by 6 months of age, infants seem to understand that if you have more allies, you're likely to be more dominant over a group with fewer allies. All right. And what's interesting is they show success with this type of task many months earlier than they showed understanding that bigger is stronger. They seem to be particularly sensitive to these group dynamics and which group a person is affiliated with when reasoning about social dominance. From here, we are motivated to understand what else do they understand about social dominance? And so I phrase it kind of a little vaguely here about how advanced is their understanding. Really what we're trying to get at is, what other intuitions do children have about the role of social groups in the context of conflict between agents? And we really want to try to get at this question about, what role do these allies play, the extra group members, or what roles do they play, and why do allies matter? I want you to think for a moment about, in your own life, in your own experiences, why do you think it's beneficial if you have more allies when there's a conflict you're engaged with over another group? I think one of the ideas that probably comes to mind pretty readily is that we help each other. Allies tend to help other allies. And if you're a part of a group, that in some ways you function as a team, and if someone needs help, you provide that help. And so maybe what the intuitions were that babies had was that an individual with more allies is likely to be dominant because there's more people who can help them or defend them. But that's the research question. That becomes the exciting thing that we can try to explore and find out, is in fact that what infants are thinking, or is it just a real simple heuristic? If you have more allies, you'll be more dominant, but I'm just too young to understand how those allies can actually help you. I just know more is better. So we wanted to test this, and we had an opportunity to do so. And we showed 12-month-old babies 2 types of videos. One where an ally comes down and helps their own group member. Let's watch this. So there's a conflict. So a little violent. That's the extent to which we can get really violent with baby videos. But you can see that the ally comes down, knocks the blue guy out of the way, and then the other green character can keep crossing the platform. They would also see, and we treated this as the expected outcome if they think that the role of group members is to help one of their own. We contrast that with a scenario where one of the allies comes down and helps an opposing group member. Cool. So again, the way we then set out to measure this, and again, we call this the unexpected outcome. And our prediction was that if babies think that group members are expected to help, they're going to be surprised when an ally helps an opposing group member. So this expected outcome should be met with boredom quicker by babies watching this, versus when the ally comes down and knocks their own teammate off the platform so the other side can win this contest. We'd expect babies to show a lot more surprise in a case like this. And again, an alternative here is just that babies don't have any expectations about group members. They maybe have a heuristic that more is better, but no understanding about why that could be the case. Here, the only way that they could solve this is if they specifically had a belief that an ally is supposed to help an own group member, not a member of another group. And indeed, what we found is that babies looked a lot more at the unexpected outcome. And so what this tells us is that by 12 months of age, infants are expecting that allies should be helping a member of their own group, not a member of an opposing group. And what's really amazing about this, just for a moment, is these are groups that are just made up, right? Babies don't come into our lab having an idea of there being a green team and a blue team in the world. These aren't groups that babies themselves have participated in. But very quickly, we can just demonstrate there's a green group and a blue group, and there's already these expectations by 12 months of age that a member of a group is going to help someone from their own group, not someone from an opposing group. So it then dawned on us that it's not always the case that allies are in a position to help. Sometimes our group members aren't even aware that there is a problem in the first place, or a conflict to begin with. And so we sought out to ask whether allies have to know that there's a conflict involving one of their own group members before they'll, in order to confer a competitive advantage. So if you remember in the classic study we did, we took two groups, a group of 3 and a group of 2, and one agent from each group came down and tried to cross the platform. And babies expected that the agent from the larger numerical group will win. Here, what we did is we just tried to mask the ability for all those allies to know what the heck is going on. Let's take a look. So you can see they're jumping behind this little shelf, and their eyes are occluded, so they can't actually see what's happening. And then they'd see the agents come down. They bump into each other. And so then we show them two outcomes, one where the agent from the numerically larger group gets their way, and one where an agent from the numerically smaller group gets their way. So put differently, one where the green guy wins and one where the blue guy wins. And what we found was that babies showed no interest or equal interest in both videos. There was no relative surprise watching one video compared with another one. And what's really fascinating about this is that even though one group has more allies, because none of these allies can actually see what's going on, babies didn't form an expectation that one group is likely to be more dominant. So it's not just that having more allies is what affords dominance over another group. It's that the allies have to know what is going on for that to happen. And so again, they had no expectations of one individual being more dominant over another when their friends are unaware that there's a conflict happening. But we wanted to further test this, and we wanted greater evidence that they really are sensitive to what the allies are able to see or witness during a conflict. So we came up with another experiment. And let's watch the video for what happens here and see if you notice the difference. So do you catch this difference? So both groups have the same numerical size, but only one group has allies that can actually see what's happening. So, and the other group, the green group here, the eyes of their allies are occluded. So it's behind the platform, so they can't know what's happening down below. And if awareness of that conflict is what really matters, then you'd say the blue group is numerically superior than the green group, right? Because there's more allies that can actually witness what's happening. And so we showed them a couple of different events, one where the blue agent, whose group members are aware that there's a conflict, gets their way. We'll call this the expected outcome. And one where the green agent is the one that gets their way. And if you recall, the green agent has the allies that can't see what's happening. And we call this the unexpected outcome. And what we found, and again, if infants are sensitive to not just who has more allies, but who has more allies that can actually witness that there is a conflict, then we'd expect them to be bored faster with this video on the left compared with the video outcome on the right. And this is in fact what we see, that infants looked much longer at the unexpected outcome. And this tells us that by 12 months of age, infants already seem to think that if your friends are snoozing, you're going to lose. If your friends aren't around to help you and to see what's happening, they're not going to be in a position, presumably, to help you in a conflict. And so what does all this taken together tell us about what babies understand about social dominance? I think it tells us a couple of things. One is that even though babies can appreciate that in thinking about their parents, that they may be bigger than them, they're also sending you a warning, which is you better watch out when their friends come over for a play date, because they might be able to outnumber you. And that's a critical dimension that infants are already able to use to reason about social dominance. And so just to kind of recap what I think are some of the broader principles that we're learning here. One is that we clearly see evidence that babies can think about social dominance already between 6 and 12 months of age. They seem to understand that bigger is stronger. And they seem to understand that there's strength in numbers as well. And so these are two different ways in which they arrive at being able to make inferences, judgments about who is likely to be dominant in a particular situation. Of course, we're using instances of physical dominance where you get your right of way. Be happy to talk in the Q&A later about other ways in which we might consider studying social dominance, because social dominance isn't only restricted to physical forms of conflict. One of the other things that we learned today is that infants' reasoning about strength in numbers depends on a few things. It depends on whether the allies can actually witness a conflict. Just having more friends who are never actually there and around to witness what's going on isn't enough to confer a competitive advantage. What really seems to matter is that they're able to witness the conflict. And if they're able to witness the conflict, then you really derive a benefit from having more friends. But why? Well, I think one of the studies that we discussed today suggests that the reason why being able to see that conflict is important is because already by 12 months of age, infants have expectations that allies are supposed to help a member of their own group, not a member of the opposing group. And so that seems to be one reason why witnessing a conflict is particularly relevant, is because it puts the allies in a position to actually do something about that conflict, to be able to come down and help out one of their own group members. Now, we haven't studied this yet, but one of the things that I think would be really exciting to do, and maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A in a moment, is a lot of these babies are pre-verbal. And of course, my son's in the other room, but if he needed my help, he would, and he's 10 now, he would use his language to call out to me. So I don't have to see what's going on with him in the adjacent room. I have to be able to hear and listen. And it would be interesting whether as babies become more linguistic and are able to produce and communicate more, whether they start to modulate their expectations. Perhaps they're maybe able to think that even though I can't see, as long as the agent can still talk and communicate, they'll still be expected to come and help them or confer some numerical advantage. What I want to do is to quickly wrap up. I just want to thank all of the families that have come to our lab at UBC. We're the Social Cognitive Development Lab, but we're a part of the Early Development Research Group that Portia mentioned earlier that has a bunch of labs studying early child development. And there's a variety of ways in which, if you're interested in finding out more about what we do or signing up for some of these studies or just to hear about the studies that we run, you can sign up for. But since I moved to UBC back in 2010, I also founded a research partnership at Science World called the Living Lab. And it's an actual research lab that we built on the second floor of Science World near the Wonder Gallery, where families can interact with our researchers on a daily basis and can ask questions about early child development, can see how our studies work. And we do studies from infancy through adolescence. So it's another way in which you can get to know us and hear more about what we're up to there. And I just want to put out a quick plug for our final talk of the series for this summer with my colleague, Dr. Emberson, who will be talking with us about how babies learn more generally, about all kinds of interesting concepts. And that talk's going to be happening in just over a month. And so now I'm looking forward to fielding any questions that you guys have for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Byron, for joining us today. Dr. Byron would love to answer some of your questions now. So if you haven't already, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may view questions others have submitted and vote for ones that you would like to answer. So we already have one question from Shannon, and it says, what assumptions are built into the research design regarding recognizing who is part of a common team, that is the color groupings? And also, how do we know these would map onto recognized social differences like age, and would or have you measured this? And then lastly, that is how do you know which commonalities infants are actually sensitive to in determining who is part of an allied or opposing group? I'm happy to read it again if you want.
Well, yeah, there's a lot that's packed in there, which is fantastic. So we'll call this more than one question. So the first question is sort of what are the assumptions built into the research design about how it is that children even perceive these as groups, right? And I'll say a few things about this. It's not just about, I'll just pick a random video to illustrate this. Maybe we'll go here. So it's not just about having color, because very easily you can group all kinds of colored objects together, and babies using different principles will think it's one group. Here, what was really relevant to us is we had, first, the eyes help a lot just to make them agents as opposed to just inanimate geometric blobs. And so we knew from past research that eyes would be helpful, at least to get them to think about these as individuals, people. But then it was the spatiotemporal, which is a fancy term for taking two sets of individuals and spreading them out physically, so there's distance between them. That's a cue that we know helps kids to start to group things together and sort of say group A, group B. That doesn't necessarily make it a social group yet, but just helps us to differentiate them a little bit. But then it's having the moving in unison, the jumping that we saw. I think this video does it, yeah. So we get these little jumps together like this. This helps babies to think of them as a cohesive group. And again, do the same thing separately with the green one. Just gonna pause it. And so here, what's important is that when one group is sort of jumping up and down like this together, and another group does it at a different point in time, it helps babies to start to think that this is one group and this is one group. And then that's it. And so those are some of the assumptions that we made, although I would call these more informed assumptions based on existing research as cues that are helpful to get babies to think of these as of a kind, of a group. I think the other thing that makes it helpful in one of the assumptions sort of built in is that when you get a conflict, that really motivates children to start to figure out who the players are, who the groups are, if there's more than one individual there. And so having that conflict, I think, was important. And so some other research that we're doing in our lab now is we'll introduce them to groups, but not show a conflict, but then see if they're more likely to offer help when it's in a non-conflict kind of scenario. So someone's trying to open a container, do they expect someone else to come down and help them open that container from their group? And so I would say that's one of the assumptions, some of the assumptions that were built in initially with the research design, again, but informed by research. Another part of the question has to do with sort of how does this like map on then to how we think about social groups that children can participate in, as well as how does this map onto just real world social groups, right? Because greens and blues are not social groups that children will encounter in the real world, except through their own, pretend play. What we know about infancy is that they are, by 12 months of age, they're able to think about a variety of social categories. So they can certainly think about gender. They have some ideas about race, although I would say it's a very, it looks really different from how a 3 or 4-year-old thinks about race. There's a lot that's changing in their conceptual understanding of what race constitutes. But they can at least categorize people based on skin color within the first year. They also seem to be sensitive a bit to age, and those are the kinds of categories that we have a lot of experience with in our lives, and certainly babies do as well. But there's a lot of research showing that babies also in the first year of life can form novel categories, meaning you can get a group of blue t-shirt people and a group of red t-shirt people, and they can start to think of these as being different groups, and grouping them with that sort of surface level similarity. And so what it tells me is that within the first year of life, we're really wired to think about people in terms of social groups that they could participate in. But these aren't all stable, meaning the way kids aren't always thinking about these categories. They often get primed, but they can learn about a novel group one day, forget about it the next day. I think that the groups that they care most about in their lives are the ones that they have the most experience with. And so you're going to see cultural variation depending on the kinds of categories that are most important in one's cultural milieu, their upbringing, that young children will pay attention to a greater extent. The ones that are going to be more culturally significant in their upbringing. So you see a lot of variation in which categories they pay attention to. So I think there's a lot of factors that influence which types of groups and why children will pay attention to, starting in infancy and through early childhood. And then Portia, I might defer back to you to see if there's a part of the question I did not get to.
No, I think you did touch on all of them. Yeah. And Shannon replied saying it was very interesting.
Thanks.
And then the next question is, do children on the autism spectrum know about social dominance? And this is because as we all know that they have social communication problems.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. We haven't directly assessed this. It's not something we've measured. I think it'll be difficult, obviously, with the age group that we described here for studies in infancy, because we don't have the clear ways of assessing children on that spectrum at that young of an age. It certainly gets more robust as we get into early childhood, but there's a lot to understand still about social dominance. And I could see some points where there could be divergence with children on the spectrum in terms of what they might think about in terms of social dominance. So for example, I might predict that they might be very successful at solving in early childhood the same bigger, stronger, or more allies. You're going to be more dominant over someone with fewer allies. But I'll tell you quickly about something that we've done with 3 and 4-year-olds that's relevant. And this would be a great age because by now we have better assessments of where children are on the spectrum. And so after seeing that original dominance video, we did a study with 3 and 4-year-olds. After seeing that original video where the group of 3 has an agent who's dominant over the group of 2, we then introduce children to the actual agents that just had that conflict. And we say they just came across this object that they've never seen before. And we're trying to figure out, what on earth is this object? And this is the researcher asking, what's this called? And then the dominant agent, the person who just had, previously won that contest, offers a suggestion. It's a fat, which is a novel word kids wouldn't have heard of. And the other agent says, no, it's a Modi. And then we ask the child, so who's right? Is it green or blue? And children are more likely to accept the label offered by the dominant individual. So you demonstrated that you're physically dominant over someone else. And now as a 3 and 4-year-old, I'm more likely to trust you as being knowledgeable about what a novel object is called. So I'm more likely to choose to learn from you. This is where I might expect some divergence with children on that spectrum, where given it's a language-based task, and we know that there's a social deficit with language, with autism, that I might see that this might be more of a struggle than the question of who do you think is going to be more dominant in the physical right-of-way task that we did previously.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. And then the next question is, well, Sadaf would like you to explain a little bit more about how you observe these infants in the lab. How long do you observe them when carrying out this research?
Yeah. Well, it depends. If they start out napping, then we might be observing them for quite some time, and that does happen. In fact, I remember when my son was an infant and brought him into the lab to participate in a study, he fell asleep in the middle of the study, and so it sort of took a lot longer. And it also maybe, I think, motivated me to make it a little bit more exciting and attention getting. But when babies come into the lab, and we're first, the primary goal is just get comfortable, parent, child get comfortable in the lab. And then when they sit down in front of a computer, then we're observing them from that point forward. And basically for each video that they see, we'll have a tiny little camera beneath the monitor or screen that they're looking at, just capturing their attention and where they're looking on the screen. Are they looking in the corner? Are they looking down? Are they looking in the middle? But the whole process, it's only a few minutes of actual engagement with the videos. So when I talked about how, let's see if I can flip back, to give you an example. So when we talk about measuring how long babies look at the expected outcome versus the unexpected outcome, the average time babies spend looking at each of these videos is anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds. And so it's a brief observational encounter, but it's so consistent that babies will spend more time looking at the unexpected outcome, maybe 15 seconds there, 10 seconds at the expected outcome, and every baby is doing something like this, or it's usually about 85% of the babies do this. And so the observational period is quite short, few minutes of being in the study. The time we spend with them as a researcher and the family is a bit longer than that, in large part because we just want to help the child become more comfortable before they begin the study. And so they're just more relaxed and interested in it.
And we have one more question. And it says, in this area, which is social dominance, is it based on people's cognitive intelligence? Is that a factor that influences this area of social dominance?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. So I don't know the answer. And I imagine the answer might look different depending on the age of the child you study, as well as the ways in which you measure social dominance. And again, the way we started out, these are just physical conflicts, but social dominance can be experienced, realized, manifested in a lot of different ways. And in infancy, we don't have the tools to measure those kinds of higher order cognitive, intelligence, things like that yet. We have measures as children get older, but that research hasn't been done to look at what else does that predict in a non-clinical sense about children's processing. Again, I could imagine that those kinds of measures might tell us that it makes a difference in some aspects of reasoning about social dominance with older kids. Probably not as much when it comes to maybe these more physical kinds of conflicts with bigger is stronger, more allies is better. I think those kinds of judgments are likely going to just be fairly similar across individuals. But I could imagine as children get older that it might get more nuanced with other ways of thinking about social dominance. But at least with babies, we don't have the capacity. I mean, there aren't the tools there to really measure clearly things like intelligence or cognitive capacity of reasoning at that young age that we could ever use to ask that question at this stage of the science.
And that brings us to the end of the questions and to the end of the talk. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Once again, this video is being recorded and will be shared on the EDRG website. So if more questions come to mind, please do feel free to send us an email. I dropped the email address in the chat. I hope you have a really great day. It's sunny outside, and we hope to see you at our next talk. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.